Is this on? I'm at a chrono accelerator. I'm sure I can do this. Much like the story of how Kronos killed Uranus, and then how Zeus killed Kronos, and then Kronos came back and then almost killed Zeus, but then was killed by Percy Jackson, I'm pretty sure, I haven't read the books in a while, every game will one day be usurped by its cooler, younger successor. Neverwinter Nights was the king of the MMO genre, until a couple years later when EverQuest came out, and suddenly it was the king of the MMO genre, until a couple years after that when World of Warcraft came out, and suddenly it was the king of the MMO genre. It's a tale as old as time, really. Much like Macbeth, a king's rule can't last forever, and in the case of Overwatch, up until very recently, many thought the king had fallen. It's no secret that Blizzard's modern darling was a little touch and go for a minute there. Ever since it added the 2 to its title, many internet commentators had dismissed it as practically dead and buried, especially around a year ago when Marvel's hit new hero shooter came to steal its thunder. Marvel Rivals was the breath of fresh air the hero shooter genre had sorely needed when it came out, and at the time the internet was awash with discussion about how it seemed to have filled a hole in the market that was created as a direct result of one of the biggest fumbles in gaming history. It was such a big hit that back then people were questioning whether Overwatch, the game and the IP, were even good to begin with. Many were saying that Marvel Rivals was doing everything Overwatch had done but better. By all accounts, it was the Overwatch killer. But today, at time of recording, I think you'll find that public consensus is a little different. Both Marvel Rivals and Overwatch are alive and well. 'Twas not Jeff the Shark that squad wiped the 5-stack, as it turns out. And so sitting here now, I'm forced to ask a question I think the online gaming community has long needed to answer. What's the deal with the insert game here killer? Well, to answer that question, we've got to rewind a bit and understand how a game like Overwatch, something once so popular it was considered the defining game of its genre, could get to a point where people thought its empire was going to come toppling down. On the surface, the story I'm about to tell you is that of 2 different but very similar games, Overwatch and Marvel Rivals. But more broadly, this is a tale as old as the medium of video games itself. Swap out the names and specifics and you probably witnessed this exact series of events play out surrounding a game that you love. You might have even fallen victim to the same mob mentality I'm about to speak of. I know I certainly have. You want to know the truth about the insert game here, killer? Well, let me take you back to a time before Corona when the only funny number that could be paired with 6 was 9 and when AI had not yet defeated the Akinator. Let's turn back the clock to 2019. Back in 2019, the original Overwatch, regarded by many to be Blizzard's triumph of the modern gaming era, was going strong, getting new heroes and maps every year, sporting a vibrant esports scene and redefining what it meant to be a hero shooter. It was all going so well in fact that at BlizzCon that year, the development team made an announcement. Their hit game was getting a number. Overwatch 2 was announced as a very confusing sequel to the original game, which was sort of the same thing but also kind of not. Fans would soon figure out that Overwatch 2 was more of a big update than it was an actual sequel, and while this certainly received a bit of backlash at the time, I was personally all for it. Back in the olden days, you could release a Halo game, people could have their fun with the multiplayer, and then they could move on to the next game in a couple years, but by 2019, saying slurs in online lobbies was no longer exclusive to the Xbox 360. A new age of online games had been ushered in since then, a kind of game that didn't often see sequels because they would receive updates at such a regular cadence that they wouldn't really need a sequel. These were games designed to be their own living entities. You couldn't release a direct sequel to Overwatch built from the ground up. That would mean all the progress people had on their profiles, all the skins they'd bought, all the maps and characters that had become gaming icons at that point were all going to have to get replaced. All the developers were just going to have to put in a massive amount of work to port them all over to the new game. And at that point, you may as well just make it an update. So that's exactly what they decided to do. Don't let the word update confuse you though. The way Overwatch 2 was originally pitched suggested that the amount of content being added would well and truly equate to what we would have seen in the usual sequel. A bunch of new characters, maps and game modes were all set to be added, and the graphics were even getting a bit of an overhaul to make the game pop a little bit more. But far and away the most exciting thing announced was that the game was getting a story mode of sorts, a fully fledged PvE experience that could rival its PvP counterpart in terms of replayability. All this was announced at BlizzCon with a trailer so vague that you'd have to scour interviews after the announcement to get a proper understanding of what the game actually was. And while that might have been cause for panic in any other instance, in that moment when Overwatch 2 was announced, most fans were pretty damn excited, and I think it's pretty safe to say why that was. Overwatch 2 was not just announced with a gameplay trailer, it was of course accompanied by one of Blizzard's famous story cinematics, and oh my god, it was beautiful. You see, Overwatch 1 never really had an in-game story, but it did have a cast of iconic and lovable characters that were given life through a series of cinematics Blizzard had periodically released since the launch of the game. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but these things were so insanely well made that the story of these characters had become burned into the brains of everyone who played the game, and a good chunk of people who hadn't. Your mother has seen the Dragon cinematic, and if she says she hasn't, look man, I'm sorry, she's probably lying to you, and you might be adopted. When you log on to Overwatch on console, you'd be greeted by this.
Is this on? I made a chronal accelerator. I'm sure I can do this.
And then this big fuck-off monkey named Winston would tell you about how he's getting his band of ragtag international heroes back together, and as the music swelled and he lowered his glasses, he'd say,
"Are you with me?"
And we were all like, me? For years, as fans, we'd had all these cinematics showing exactly what my monkey goat was talking about, slowly showing the band getting back together and endearing us to a bunch of the game's characters along the way. But these things were mostly a solo affair. We would occasionally see some characters interacting, but pretty much every cinematic was focused on the perspective of just one of them. If two characters were getting together in a cinematic, it was usually the team of villains or one of our heroes facing off against them. The point of most of these shorts was to show you that it was time for whatever character you'd just spent 8 minutes of short storytelling becoming endeared to finally rejoin their team, to reform Overwatch. So it's BlizzCon 2019, and this announcement cinematic for Overwatch 2 starts. We follow my boy Winston, having recruited barely half the team he'd hoped for, charging into battle nonetheless. And just when it looks like all is lost, after waiting years to see this ragtag group of heroes reassemble, we finally got to watch all the puzzle pieces get put together. And dude, fucking chills. The moment where Genji comes in is so good, and you're like, oh my god, we've peaked. It can't get any better than this. But he hasn't even said the line yet, dude. Got it! No joke, I cried when I saw that for the first time, and I've cried in viewing since then, and it's not like it's particularly sad or anything. It's a ninja man with a sword shouting words that I don't understand, and yet still, I'm moved to literal tears when I see it. And I think that's because at the time, this was giving me and so many other fans exactly what they wanted in the span of roughly 8 minutes. There was definitely already some pretty noticeable flaws in the pitch for Overwatch 2, but back then, I personally could not have been more excited because this trailer seemed to fundamentally understand what I wanted from an Overwatch sequel. I was so pumped to have a bunch of new characters to play, new locations to visit, and new game modes to try out, but most of all, I was just excited to see where these characters would go. You see, I had this dream that at the end of the story campaign, my boy Winston would die, which I know sounds a little messed up, but can you imagine how satisfying that would have been from a narrative perspective? He dedicates his life to trying to get all his friends back together, believing that the world can be a better place, and then you have a scene where he sacrifices himself just to prove it. They toy with that exact thing happening in the reveal cinematic. I chose to ignore the very half-baked pitch of Overwatch 2 because I figured it wouldn't matter if all the new stuff they added sucked. It wouldn't even matter if the actual PvE content supposed to accompany the story was dog shit. If they could pull off that scene at the end of a campaign, or numerous others that had been set up as well, I would have been more than happy with the sequel. But of course, unfortunately for me, that damn ape is still kicking. That scene I wanted never happened, and it wasn't the only thing not to happen. A lot of what Blizzard promised in the initial reveal trailer was not there when the game finally launched. But in 2019, we were still a ways out from launch. How far out exactly? Well, we didn't really know, because once BlizzCon was all said and done and the hype train had left the station, we found ourselves in a new era of Overwatch. The Dark Ages. Overwatch 2 was the game that never really seemed to want to come out, which is weird because from announcement to release it only took a little under 3 years, which is still a long time, but have you talked to the Elder Scrolls community recently? 3 is manageable. See, you would assume that if you were making a sequel to a game that would essentially serve as a big update, you would probably work on that concurrently with other content. But though the exact timeline of how Overwatch 2 came to be is still a little unclear, at least from the outside looking in, what appeared to happen was that in April of 2020, Overwatch's final character was released, and then for the next 2.5 years, all the development effort went into the sequel. Apart from balance changes, Overwatch pretty much stopped receiving updates for most of 2020 to 2022, and that is an absolute knife in the heart for a live service game. Speaking anecdotally, Overwatch just felt so dead during that period, not just in terms of queue times, but in terms of atmosphere. It was bleak. Now that would have been very different had we had a tidal wave of information coming out about the sequel as well, but we didn't. Most of that came in the 6 or so months up to release, and though we'd see a new map here or there, all we really had to tide us over was the drip feed of how they were updating hero designs. Holy shit, Junkrat got a new haircut and he changed his pants? Let's fucking go! This drought of information and updates was particularly damning because we were all working off the assumption that Blizzard was going to add a bunch of new characters and maps, and that this PvE mode was going to have a ton of missions and customization. But also, we didn't know that for sure. They were super unclear about what they were actually adding for the sequel. Like, heroes. For most of the 2.5 years between reveal and release, we only had been shown one new hero, and there obviously wasn't only going to be one new hero, but again, we had no idea how many there were going to be. For all we knew, they might have just been adding one. My thinking at the time was that because Overwatch 1 released with 21 characters, and because any new ones they added were going to have to be balanced against all the old ones they already had, I figured the sequel would probably launch with maybe half as many. 10. Maybe 10.5 if we were lucky. Imagine my surprise when it launched with 3. We knew the outline of Overwatch 2, more characters, more maps, more game modes, and PvE, but we didn't know the specifics, and with that sort of outline, the specifics are pretty damn important. Because as it turns out, though you'd think if you were going to make a sequel to one of the most popular shooter games on the market, you'd probably hire up a bit, get a couple more people on board to help manage the load of updating the old game, whilst also creating a worthy successor. From what any of us can tell, that's not what happened. The team seemed to remain relatively the same, and instead of working to add oodles more content, they just withheld content for 2.5 years, longer if you count some other parts of the game, forever if you count one in particular. But in 2022, they finally announced a release date, and as the year was coming to a close, Overwatch 2 finally found its way into players' hands. And unfortunately, it was so disappointing.
There's a starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds.
If you ask me, the public perception of Overwatch 2 took 3 Widow headshots throughout the course of its life cycle, and the first, and arguably the most critical, was its launch. Does that make sense? Obviously the first headshot is going to be the most critical, because after that you're dead. But Overwatch 2 did not hit the ground running. It just sort of hit the ground. From what we'd been told, the game was always going to be a 2-part package. Part 1, a big update to the pre-existing PvP game mode, and Part 2, an update introducing a new PvE game mode. The thing was, we always assumed that those 2 parts were going to come packaged together. But video game development is hard, and in 2022, the Overwatch developers had to come out and say they were having a bit of trouble getting the new PvE mode ready for a timely release, and that they didn't want to leave the old game just sitting there rotting away in the meantime. So what they were going to do was release the PvP content and the PvE content separately. All the new PvP stuff was going to launch at the end of that year, and all the new PvE stuff was going to come out later down the track. That announcement was obviously a bit of a bummer. It would have been really cool to have all that new content released at the same time, and it would have made the game really feel like a sequel. But unfortunately, this was just a decision that had to be made. The old game, the thing that was probably funding the development of this new one, was going to die before they could get everything out at the same time. There was no way around it. They had to interject some life into the Overwatch brand before all its players moved on to greener pastures, even if those players were planning on eventually returning once the sequel did come out. This was Bobby Kotick's Blizzard after all, long before the holy angel Microsoft would come and rescue it from the parasitic cycle of year-on-year profit. No, the franchise could not stop making money, even if stagnation was in pursuit of a potentially more lucrative payout a year or so down the line. Put simply, a mass exodus from the old game would be the end of the new one. So when players logged into Overwatch 2 on August 10th of 2022, or rather tried to log in thanks to some server issues, they were greeted by a very underwhelming package. There was a smattering of PvP content, a couple quality of life changes, a minor but noticeable visual uplift, an entirely new monetization scheme, and some UI changes, but ultimately, for most players, there was nothing that was added to the game that made it feel deserving of a number next to its title. And so the Widow landed her first headshot. This is the moment Overwatch's reputation as a game truly slipped, because this is where the narrative that Overwatch 2 was nothing but a crappy update began. Since that fateful day in August of 2022, anytime anyone on the internet has said the number after Overwatch's name, it has been followed by some variation of either A, "Oh, Overwatch 2? You mean that crappy update that released for Overwatch 1? Or B, "Ugh, Overwatch 2. Man, I hate that they deleted the old game to make room for that crappy sequel." Coincidentally, since August of 2022, I've been popping a couple blood vessels every time someone on the internet starts a conversation about Overwatch. Generally speaking, there is nothing I hate more than when a joke or opinion catches on in the gaming community, because the second it does, any intelligent or meaningful discussion that might actually better the medium as a whole is so far out the window that you may as well just shut your mouth and nod your head along to the Control-C, Control-V discussion points that play out in YouTube comment sections. The two talking points I just mentioned, they're literally contradictory. If you're one of the people complaining about how Overwatch 2 was just a big update for the old game, whilst also complaining that they deleted the old game to make room for the sequel, take a look at yourself in the mirror and ask what it'd actually be like to form your own opinion for once. Do you know what an update is, dog? It's the old game. but more. Look, I get it. Overwatch 2 on launch was profoundly disappointing, and if we all stay cool for just a couple more seconds, I'll tell you why, but I first would just like to ask that we finally stop with this narrative that Overwatch 2 was just a regular old update. No, the content it ultimately added on launch probably did not justify it getting the number 2 added to its name, but for better or worse, it did still rebuild a lot of the original game's elements, and at the very least, it had a more noticeable graphical update than most sports games get. It's a very hard game to define. It was at one point a sequel, but thanks to the way it was released, it isn't. But for the love of God, if you're just making the same jokes about it being a crappy sequel or an update to the old game, please move on. Speaking of which, I should probably do the same. Splitting the launch of Overwatch 2 did not do the game's image any favors, but I think even if it had released as a complete package, the narrative around it still wouldn't have been very positive. In the years that followed, the issues with the half of the game that we did actually get to start playing started to become very apparent, and so the community found itself in different but familiar territory. We entered the Dark Ages 2. Alright, this is going to be a long one. By the time 2022 was coming to a close, Overwatch had returned to receiving regular updates, but whereas the first Dark Ages was defined by a lack of new content, the second Dark Ages was defined by a general dissatisfaction with new content. Any grace period Overwatch 2 might have had after it launched didn't last very long, because there wasn't a lot to hold on to. Like I complained about earlier, the game only saw 3 new heroes added to its roster, which was less than it would have received had it continued with its original patch cadence. Yes, there were 6 new maps, a couple character reworks, and a new game mode added as well, but unfortunately, as much as I wish it wasn't the case, people were never going to get as excited for maps and modes as they were for heroes. And to be fair, when the game launched, there were moments where Overwatch 2 did really feel like a new game. If you were playing on a new map and each team featured some of the new or reworked heroes, it could really feel like a sequel. But at the same time, every once in a while you might just end up on King's Row with the same characters you played a million times before populating the lobby, and it would almost feel like nothing had changed at all. It was those games where players just felt like they were back in Overwatch 1 again that are to blame for the second Widow headshot the game received. It's stagnation. We know now that trying to develop the PvE experience was drawing too many resources away from the PvP team, which is why when we returned to regular updates, it still felt like not enough was changing or being added. But through Overwatch's first few seasons, we didn't know that, and we still didn't know exactly what PvE was going to look like, and we were just trying to make the most out of this half-baked sequel we'd been handed. And unfortunately, stagnation doesn't just make a game boring, it makes its flaws, which might otherwise have gone unnoticed or just been shrugged off, extremely apparent. 5v5. Yes, while I'm pleased we've gotten this far into the video without me mentioning it, it was/is important enough of an issue where it was going to have to come up eventually. If you've been really vibing with this video and you think that there's a chance that an opinion on this subject might potentially harsh that vibe, please skip through to the next part. I mean, I know you won't, you sick fuck, but you should. For people who aren't in the know, Overwatch 1 was originally designed around 2 teams of 6 going head to head. There were no restrictions at first. You could have 6 of the same hero if you wanted. God forbid you could have 6 Torbjorns if you were feeling particularly psychopathic. But over the course of the game's life cycle, we started to see more limitations get introduced. Not so long after the original game's launch, they made it so that you could only have 1 of each hero on your team. That wasn't so controversial. What was controversial was the eventual introduction of role queue, which meant that every team could only have 2 DPS, 2 healers, and 2 tanks. This meant when you queued for a match, you'd be picking which roles you wanted to play, and once your match was made and you were actually in the game, you'd only be able to choose heroes from whichever role you happened to queue into. Now this was a necessary change, because when you don't put this sort of restriction on a game like Overwatch, people are going to come up with some fucked up team compositions. There is no room for true competition without role queue. At the same time though, introducing a system where you queue individually for each role will inevitably make queue times way longer, especially if you're trying to play DPS. After role queue was added, Overwatch 1 developed a massive problem with queue times, because people didn't really want to queue for being healer, and they especially didn't want to queue for being tank. At the end of the day, when someone logs into a hero shooter, all they really want to do is eat hot chip and shoot gun. So if you wanted to play DPS on your team, you were gonna inevitably have a bit of competition for that spot. You best be pulling up Geometry Dash in a separate tab, brother. You got time to kill. So when Overwatch 2 released, they made a change that might on the surface have seemed a little small, but actually ended up having a huge impact on the way games were played. The game switched from being 6v6 to 5v5, and of all the things that changed between Overwatch 1 and 2, this would define itself as the most controversial. This explanation's already going on too long, and I don't really want to go in depth on why 5v5 was such a hated change, but Just briefly, 5v5 meant one less tank on each team, and that put a lot of pressure on the person in that role. It also meant that the best strategy to win a given match was for the tank player to keep swapping to whichever tank was most effective against the enemy teams, to a point where tanks felt like they were spending more time in the hero gallery than they were in the actual game. This change was always going to be controversial. It meant that if you had a group of 6 friends at the time, one of them was going to be finding out they were the least favourite. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was that because the only thing players had to keep themselves entertained in the months following Overwatch 2's release was the occasional new hero or map, the argument surrounding 5v5 developed into a much bigger scandal than it had any right to be. Look, I'm going to put my biases out on the table here. I'm a tank player. A shit one, but a tank player nonetheless, and I'm part of a very small minority who liked 5v5 from the start. But I'm clearly against the community on that one, and frankly, I don't care enough to argue my case for it. I've always figured if the player base is happy, so am I. So I guess I kinda am for 6v6 in that regard. But what I will say is that as a tank player, and one that's generally hung around the median line, mind you, I think the community outrage to this issue was at least a little overblown. Balancing in any competitive online game is a very tricky thing to do, because chances are the changes you make will affect players at different levels of skill differently. You buff a more technical hero like Genji, and that will have a more noticeable effect for more skilled players, and it's the opposite if you buff a point-and-click shooter character like Bastion. But in terms of how 5v5 changed the core gameplay of Overwatch, for players in higher skill brackets, the minority, I get the impression that this change was extremely frustrating. But for anyone lower than like maybe Platinum? I don't think this was as big of a deal as some people made it out to be. Counter-swapping could still be very frustrating, even as a low-ranked tank player, but if I may counter-swap and play the devil's advocate for a moment, I think I rarely experienced games where I felt as though I couldn't have still pushed my team to the win had I just played better. Because yeah, switching to Zarya will always be a counter to D.Va, and if there's not another tank player on the team, there will be occasions where sticking as Zarya means game, set, and match. But if you're only switching to a character because you think it has some Pokemon 4 times effectiveness against your enemy, chances are, unless you're very good at the game, the other player will probably still be better than you, because they're playing a character they actually know how to play. Look, I know this is probably alienating me from anyone that's listened up until this point, but all I'm asking is that if you, like me, will be stuck in gold or lower for the rest of your days, please consider whether you did hate or do hate 5v5 purely because of how it changed the core gameplay, or in part because of how it changed community sentiment. The most skilled players will always have a louder voice in community discussion because you don't become an Overwatch streamer unless you're pretty damn good at the game. And when those people who are pretty damn good at the game aren't satisfied with the state of affairs, that negative sentiment has a way of trickling down to people who work in warehouses for a living and probably wouldn't otherwise care about said complaints. Now, moving on from the 5v5 debate. Thank God. Whichever side of this meaningless discussion you sit on, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a player who didn't at the very least think Blizzard should have devoted more time to address this earlier on. 5v5 was a target around the neck of Overwatch that people both playing the game and people who weren't knew about. And though the queue times were certainly better than they were previously, the community was demanding some kind of change to the 5v5 format long before the developers acknowledged these complaints in any meaningful way. The second headshot to Overwatch 2's reputation was that it stagnated for too long, but I do think the snowball of hatred that developed for 5v5 was largely on the developers. It was made worse because there just wasn't enough content coming out to distract from it, but the community was going to get frustrated with it sooner or later. Unfortunately for the developers, it was sooner, and in this particular instance, I don't think they met the negative sentiment quickly enough, and so Overwatch 2 was dealt another blow as a result. And if you can believe it, we're only halfway through this section. The other thing that the stagnation of Overwatch 2 catalyzed, at least for me, was hatred for the game's stupid new free-to-play model. Overwatch 1 was never really known for having great monetization. In fact, I don't know if you know this, it pretty infamously featured loot boxes, which is one of the most predatory monetization systems in the entire industry. Nah, just kidding. Teaching gambling to impressionable young kids is totally fine. Morality who? Look, I probably don't need to tell you that gambling is bad and that this was a shitty way to monetize the game, but what I probably do need to tell you is that I actually kind of like the gambling though. No, there was never a point in Overwatch 1 where loot boxes weren't a predatory practice, but after a little while, they did start to make them a lot more consumer friendly, which probably still doesn't rise to the ethical standard of a manual can't, but you know, it is appreciated. Loot boxes always used to reward you with 4 randomly selected items of varying rarity, and when the game first released, this system was just like a slot machine. Getting a legendary or a win was pretty rare, and after you'd opened a couple loot boxes, you'd start stumbling upon a lot of duplicates, which would only award you a pretty dismal amount of in-game currency. They were scummy, and clearly the brainchild of everybody's favourite Moneyball character, Steven Schott. They were also particularly bad because Overwatch cost money to buy, and yet if you wanted cosmetics, you still had to roll the dice. But what will be forgotten as time goes on is that one element of Overwatch's monetization was a lot better than many of its peers, and that was because you could earn loot boxes and in turn currency to buy skins you hadn't gotten lucky with by just playing the game. And there wasn't a limit on how many you could earn, and it wasn't particularly hard to earn them either. You got one every time you leveled up, and you could get a couple extra each week by simply playing playing certain game modes. On top of that, the odds of getting a legendary became far higher across the game's lifecycle, and the odds of getting a duplicate were reduced to practically zero. For a short period of time, Overwatch had a monetization system that, yeah, was still encouraging gambling, but because you were already paying 40 something bucks to play the game, at least seemed to be decently fair to players. You could have charged $100 for every loot box, but I would have still been somewhat content with the game's monetization system because I knew that I could just earn my most wanted cosmetics by simply playing the game. And people did. Anyone that played a fair amount of Overwatch 1 probably almost has every cosmetic from the original game. You could not say the same thing about Overwatch 2 players. Free to play in concept is great. It means that more people get to experience good games, and I do think that though I absolutely despise their downsides, most of the time if the game maintains its core loop, I'd rather the gates be open to everyone. But with that being said, I'm still going to whine about it like a little bitch. On launch, Overwatch 2 had all the tenets of the typical seasonal free-to-play model bandaged onto the remnants of its old monetization system. Battle Pass, rotating item shop, ridiculous prices, all your favorites were there, but in the case of Overwatch 2's monetization shakeup, they were accompanied by all the old cosmetics becoming infinitely harder to access. You could still earn old skins, sure, but nothing like you were able to before. If you paid money for the Battle Pass, you might be able to afford 2 or 3 old skins tops, as compared to the before times where you paid for the game once and could earn as many as you damn well pleased way quicker. This new system sucked shit compared to the old one, because while the path to earning old stuff was bad, if you wanted any new skins, well, bad luck, buddy. Barely any of the new cosmetics could be earned without either cashing in or playing a ludicrous amount of the game to earn a sliver of what you could before. Take the Battle Pass as an example. If you purchased the premium Battle Pass for real life money, every time you'd level up, you'd get 1, occasionally 2 cosmetics. In Overwatch 1, they might have been random, but every time you leveled up, you got a loot box which would give you 4, and you didn't stop getting them at level 80, and the system wasn't designed to gatekeep you half as severely, and you didn't have to pay $15 every 10 weeks into infinity to keep getting these cosmetics. The original monetization system in Overwatch 2 would have sucked ass on its best day, but compared to what came before it, it was a disgrace. If you're still playing an online multiplayer game that charges for entry, let's be honest, the privilege of earning rewards is probably locked behind a paywall for you as well, but if it's not, guard that shit with your life. Because if Overwatch 2 is anything to go off, if your game does go free to play, you're not just going to lose access to new content, you're going to lose access to the old stuff as well. Alright, Widowmaker's only got 1 bullet left in the chamber, and if the Overwatch name did still have any life left in it, this was going to be the bullet to snuff it out completely. The launch of Overwatch 2 was supposed to be half the package. We've established that, but while that was frustrating, that was never the end of the world, because back then, the other part of the game was still just around the corner. In 2026 though, I've been going around this corner for a little while now, dog, and I'm starting to feel a little dizzy. PvE died a long and painful death. First it was delayed past the launch of the game, then it was chopped up into parts, then it was cut entirely. And to be honest, my hype, and I think a lot of the communities, was dead long before the final announcement came. My dream of seeing that fucking ape kick the bucket wasn't burned at the stake, it was boiled alive like a dumbass frog kicking around in a pot. You see, the original vision was that PvE would essentially launch as a Halo-like story mode stapled onto the main game, a set of missions that would tell a complete story start to end. And these missions were going to gain their value through replayability. The original Overwatch had shown what this would look like during an event they used to hold called Archives, where you could run your way through a story mission trying to get it done as cleanly as possible. That once-a-year event on its own probably wasn't half as engaging as a full PvE mode would need to be, but there was definitely potential there. Besides just the appeal of a high score or fast completion, that game mode was really enjoyable because you were also kind of competing to be the most valuable player on the team, constantly checking the stats to see if you were the one hard carrying or the one being hard carried. It had its own unique sort of fun to it. And the Overwatch 2 PvE experience was going to build off that, letting you customize the playable characters in unique and interesting ways, introducing the ability to level up your heroes as a form of progress, and elevating the fairly simple mission structure to be far grander in scope and with more diversity in gameplay. Even though this game mode would never truly see the light of day, the crazy thing is, there was a demo playable at the same BlizzCon it was announced at. And the even crazier thing is, they actually released 3 missions of the game mode before they cancelled it. Yeah man, I bet you forgot about that $15 you spent 2 years ago, didn't you? In August of 2023, Overwatch 2 Invasion released, the biggest update to the game since the sequel first launched. It added a new hero, new seasonal content, a new game mode with 2 new maps, and of course, the first 3 missions of the PvE game mode. And what were those gameplay missions like, you ask? Well, it's a little complicated. On release, these 3 missions were met by pretty unanimous backlash, and it's easy to understand why. They were missing everything that was supposed to make them feel like new content. They felt like Archives missions from the previous game, just with some new tech. You get to see some new parts of PvP maps you wouldn't normally see, but otherwise the actual minute-to-minute gameplay was functionally the same, because the decision to release only 3 of them meant they'd had to cut the new systems that were originally supposed to come packaged with. Comparing the final product to the original pitch was an absolute joke. It was not in any way a fully fledged mode that could rival the PvP part start of the game, it felt like a $15 scam. But for this video, not only did I go back and rewatch a lot of the old marketing material that came out for this game mode, I also went back and actually played the 3 missions. And as the only person here who can actually say they've played these things twice, I have some thoughts. I don't think these are that bad. I also don't think they're that good. I think they were designed to appeal to a very small group of people. But most of all, I think if you actually go back and replay these missions and you rewatch some of the marketing material that was coming out around this time, I think you'll realize that the developers were probably in a very tricky position. While writing this video, I had 2 really big eye-opening moments. The first came when I was replaying the Toronto PvE mission with a team full of bots because no real human plays this game mode anymore, and I was tasked with defending 2 Omnics from a wave of enemies. I had replayed 1.5 PvE missions by this point, and while I was enjoying revisiting an Overwatch that told its story through gameplay rather than a menu screen, I can't say I was really enjoying the gameplay all that much. But in this section on Toronto, I started remembering what it was like to play the original Archives missions and the old Overwatch 1 Halloween event Junkenstein's Revenge. And I remembered that when you match made with players, it could be really exciting trying to hold an objective from an onslaught of enemies. Those missions were always boring as piss on the lowest difficulty game modes, but when you slid up the difficulty slider, they did become really thrilling, because at the end of the day, it was just Overwatch gameplay. You were playing an insanely well-designed character on an insanely well-designed map, but instead of versing a different team every time and trying to figure out how to beat them on the fly, you were versing the same team of bots and refining your strategy on how to beat them over time. They felt like raids in an MMO. They were really fun, and when I was playing on Toronto, I remembered why the pitch for PvE was so exciting. Even without the talent system or the hero missions that were supposed to accompany them, these story missions had value. My first realization was that PvE could have actually been good, and then my second realization was that, oh no, actually no, it couldn't have. This occurred to me when I was watching back over a presentation they did for BlizzCon 2021. This was the most concrete look we got at PvE in its original form, and on rewatch, 5 years on from when it originally aired, it's clear to see why this game mode never released in full. I don't know if I'm drawing more meaning from this video than actually exists in it, but I find it incredibly hard to watch because it feels like the developers kind of know that the ship is sinking and they're just trying to shovel water out as best they can. I am 98% certain Bobby Kotick is standing in the corner of the room in some of these shots, sniper rifle aimed at the developers' heads. Say the line, Jeff. It seems like they're really trying to find the good in this thing they've spent so much time working on, but are just coming up short. Listen to how they describe the new talent trees.
Yes, it's so great. And you start at the bottom of the tree, like,
yes,
oh my,
exactly.
like, and then you start working and kind of planning how you're gonna get down there. It's like, it's so fun.
Yeah, dog, that's what a talent tree is. You know other games have them too, right? This is all speculation, but going off what we do know, here's what I took away from this presentation. Overwatch 2 PvE was an idea that probably only really started to show its flaws quite late in development. The original game's experiments with PvE, on the surface, probably seemed like proof that a fully fledged game mode might work. But I think once they'd put in the development time to add on some ancillary systems and start building out the story missions, the gameplay ultimately amounted to something that would only have very limited appeal. Even with some talent trees and this weird hero mission system that they were planning that I don't even have time to get into, I don't think you would have been able to change the fact that Overwatch gameplay at its core is supposed to be experienced with other players. Like I said, if you were going to build a game mode off the back of Overwatch's PvP experience, these missions were always going to feel like raids from an MMO. And unfortunately, the market for raid-like PvE content has always been decently small thanks to it generally having a high barrier to entry. That's not even taking into account that the overlap of people who enjoy highly competitive PvP shooters and people who enjoy super intense PvE shooters would make that small audience even smaller. I could see how at the start the developers might have thought that they could make Overwatch PvE into an experience that felt fun to play in both a group and by yourself. But it was just never going to feel that way unless you released a completely separate game where the gameplay wasn't being limited by what you could do in a PvP sandbox. There are a lot of instances of fantastic single-player games releasing a fairly confident PvP mode after the fact, but there aren't a lot of stories of that happening in reverse, and I think that's for a reason. A lot of the foundational decisions that inform the gameplay of a competitive PvP game make them only suitable as multiplayer experiences. If you were designing a character like Wrecking Ball for a single-player game, he'd have a way different physics system to the one he has in Overwatch. And you know what? That hypothetical single-player game could probably get a multiplayer mode down the track because you'd only have to limit the physics system in order to make it competitive. But if you wanted to make a single-player game about the Wrecking Ball we have in Overwatch, you would have to massively enhance the physics system he has because he's not designed to feel as fun when there aren't other players for him to hit. Times that problem by the number of Overwatch heroes, and hopefully you'll see my point. I think the 3 missions of PvE that actually did get released were an experiment to see if there was an interest in what they had, because I'm I'm guessing the developers knew that if the mode couldn't be enjoyed in its bare bones state, it couldn't be enjoyed by tacking on a couple talent trees. And while there was a lot of different takes about why exactly it was bad, there was a pretty definitive consensus that these missions were mostly worthless, and so PvE ceased to exist. The cancellation of PvE was the final nail in the coffin for Overwatch's reputation. The player base had gone through 2 dark ages for nothing, and people were officially losing interest in poking their stick at the corpse of a once promising IP. I think the most disappointed I've ever felt about a video game was when I read PvE was no longer in active development, and realized that the ending for a story I loved so dearly, one that was probably already sketched on storyboards and maybe even half rendered, would never see the light of day, all because it was dependent on a flawed concept. It was, and still is, so profoundly disappointing, not least of all because replaying these missions made me realize that, oh my god, Winston was so going to fucking die. I was so right, and we were so close, but that damn gorilla keeps getting away! You do have to feel a little bad for the developers here. I think it's easy to act like the things that went wrong were plain to see from the beginning, but I think if at one point the prospect of a PvE mode excited you, you do have to acknowledge in another world you might have ended up in their same position. That's not to say anyone was wrong for feeling mad at the time though. Sympathy is a luxury of hindsight in this circumstance. Back then, people were just tired of giving the Overwatch team second chances. It felt like they'd already been given too many already, and they'd only used them to make bad decisions. And while they'd been able to survive a couple of those in the past, this time they'd arrived at a point where their position in the market was truly compromised. Their spot as the hero shooter was open for the taking, and unfortunately for them, there just so happened to be another game lurking right around the corner. There's this narrative going around at the moment that we don't want any more hero shooters, and I'd like to push back on that. I don't think people are sick of hero shooters, I think they're just sick of mid-hero shooters. Every time we see a new game in this genre come out, people always act like these things fail because the market is too overcrowded. Back in 2024, if you released a Concord, people would boo you and tell you, we already have enough hero shooters, idiot. 2. And you know what? I can't really blame anyone for doing so. Concord offered you the chance to pick between one of the most lackluster rosters of characters you could possibly conceive of. It asked the question, who do you want to play? Mr. Hard to Look At or Mrs. Uninspired? Overwatch, despite all its failures, had been sitting pretty for years because every game that tried to sit at the same table with it would usually die a not so slow but particularly painful death. Yeah, Overwatch had set an incredibly high bar for what hero shooter gameplay and map design and character kit should look like, but the real lightning in a bottle it had over every other game trying to take its place was just an insanely well-designed cast of characters. Seriously, I really think if any of these games had been able to spit out character design half as good as Tracer, they would have doubled their lifetime, which, you know, considering how long their lifetime was, probably still isn't saying much, but still. And because designing even one iconic character is such a borderline Herculean feat, Overwatch 1 and 2 had been able to survive many of their worst moments. Sure, the community could turn against the developers from time to time, but they had never really faced any real threat because even when the sentiment towards Overwatch was at a low, what was the player base going to do? Go retreat to some other game? What other game? Little Piggy gonna go play Valorant? Little Piggy gonna go hate themselves for a bit and see where they end up? No. Overwatch's player base was stuck to Overwatch. Your alternatives were playing something that wasn't really like it or playing something fugly. There was no real choice. Until there was. Because just a week after the Widow had shot its third and final bullet into Overwatch's head, Marvel rubbed their hands together with glee and pressed upload on the trailer for their new hero shooter. Uh-oh, Overwatch. Looks like Macbeth is here to take his crown. Marvel Rivals was many things I'm sure Blizzard and the Overwatch developers didn't want it to be. It was the first hero shooter with a truly AAA budget to pitch itself as a direct competitor. It had an incredibly unique and interesting visual style. It was borrowing a cast of characters with already incredible designs from one of the most popular IPs ever, and when betas began, it turned out it didn't play half as bad either. And apart from that, while it was definitely copying Overwatch's homework a bit, it looked to be fixing a lot of the spelling mistakes. Character kits were far more diverse. Melee characters were just as prominent as your traditional shooter types, and there were no restrictions on how many DPS, tanks, and healers you could have on one team. Oh, and speaking of teams, this was the one thing that every hardcore Overwatch player had been begging for. It was 6v6. In the lead up to Marvel Rivals launch, people quickly started to realize that this thing had that once-in-a-decade source people had once said Overwatch had possessed when it first released in 2016. There was nothing in the package that seemed phoned in, even in the slightest. And as much as my heart was still a little hung up on Overwatch, not even I, someone who defended the decision to switch to 5v5 earlier in this video, could deny that this game had something special about it. Throughout the months following its launch, I started to see comparison shorts appearing on my For You page that made me reflect on how Marvel Rivals had managed to not just match, but in many cases improve upon so many of Overwatch's core elements. I had always thought it was possible for a hero shooter to come into the market and compete with Overwatch, but I never thought anyone was going to come up with ultimate voice lines as iconic as or but the Mad Lad somehow managed to do it.
Armed and dangerous!
100!
At the same time, I never thought Overwatch's highlight intros were cinema, but I liked them, and I figured if someone else was going to come into the market and compete with the big O, they weren't going to put much effort into these silly little 5-second shorts that played at the end of a match. But of course, as we now know, Marvel Rivals animators have been doing lines for the past couple years, and I'm not talking about the ones they do with their pencils. The game's monetization system was better than Overwatch's. It introduced unique new features to gameplay like team-ups and environmental destruction, and the queue times were so insanely fast that there's a solid chance your neighbor is probably playing Marvel Rivals right now. With all these improvements, the game was a very appealing package, and even if it had been exactly like Overwatch, it probably still would have been a really easy sell because it would have still been offering 33 new heroes to try out and 8 new maps for people to enjoy. It's no wonder then that a lot of Overwatch content creators started to set their sights on Marvel Rivals. It was similar enough to the game they'd been trapped playing for 10 years that their fans wouldn't hate the switch up in content, and its launch was so massive that not playing it would have been a massive missed opportunity for growth. And more than anything, it was fun, and it was new, and Overwatch had been on a downhill trajectory for years at this point, and who wouldn't at least want to go and see what it was like on the other side? In the December Marvel Rivals launched, Overwatch's average monthly player count on Steam, which is not the be-all end-all but is generally a good indicator of game health, dropped by almost 7,000 players as compared to the month before. And then in January, it dropped by another 5,000. The game hadn't always been on Steam, and since it launched on that platform, it had only seen growth or stagnation in terms of monthly player count averages, and that included the months following the announcement that they were cutting PvE. So at the end of 2024, Overwatch 2 was in the worst place it had been in terms of content, gameplay, and player sentiment. A new competitor was out on the market that people were saying had improved on a lot of its core elements and was drawing attention away from it at an alarming rate. And to top it all off, there was now proof that Overwatch's player counts weren't where they used to be. Even if the numbers weren't looking bad and Overwatch hadn't just tripped over its own shoelaces 3 times in a row, Marvel Rivals was just such a strong entry in the hero shooter genre that a certain narrative was going to emerge eventually. Marvel Rivals was the game that was going to kill Overwatch. It was the Overwatch killer. And then it wasn't. It is extremely rare, and I would argue actually impossible, for a successful live service game to not encounter any issues in over a decade of existence. Even games that are now universally beloved and praised for adapting to player feedback have gone through their own dark ages at some point. Maybe those dark ages weren't quite as bad as Overwatch's, and maybe they didn't last for quite as long, but I can assure you every long-running online game has had them. Final Fantasy XIV and No Man's Sky launched as total critical failures until they picked themselves back up and started rebuilding. World of Warcraft and Destiny 2 both received expansions that supposedly ruined their respective games and caused their players to start exiting en masse, until they both started the years-long journey to redemption. And there are countless other games whose communities switch between hating them and loving them on practically an hourly basis, and the only thing that is true for all of them is that they all still exist. Because if your game has at any point had an extremely active player base, there is no one game that can extinguish the magic that once drew so many people towards it. And as much as people like to act like a single update is enough to drive off an entire player base, except for some exceedingly rare examples, the life of a once successful online game is destined to be about as long as the people who have at one point or another played it. Because really, there are only 2 things that can kill these juggernauts. Number 1, the companies that make them, and number 2, time. Much like a battle pass, the narrative of the insert game here killer is a seasonal one. It comes about during a lull and it goes away during a high. Because even if a game keeps putting out perfect updates that are perfect for that game, it's probably been that same perfect game for a really long time. And it's both natural to eventually get tired of it and natural to want to blame your dissatisfaction on anything but the root cause of the issue, which is ultimately you. I think one of the worst trends to come about in modern gaming discussion is how we talk about our relationships with our favorite games and studios like they're relationships with actual human people. During Overwatch's dark ages, I saw people say shit like, "Blizzard has betrayed my trust, and I don't care how hard they try and win me back. I've learnt my lesson." And it's like, dog, it's fucking Blizzard. It's a company. The people who made the decisions you're mad at probably got laid off last week, and the people who already made their money off you aren't the kind of people to learn lessons. They just move on to their next pump and dump. Also, it's insane to me how some people are acting all holier than thou about how Blizzard is a crappy company, and then in the same breath praising the game made by fucking NetEase. Oh no, waiter, I won't partake in the horseshit hors d'oeuvres, but I will have a bowl of that cat piss soup, please and thank you. Look man, if you want to boycott Blizzard for any number of the very valid reasons there are to boycott Blizzard, that's fine, but if you're only doing it because you think Overwatch team should have 2 tanks instead of 1, I feel like you might be denying yourself a lot of happiness for a pretty stupid reason. None of this is to undermine any one person's relationship with a piece of art. Yeah, it's a little childish to get upset about a game because the most recent patch changed Cassidy's damage drop-off, and it's a little silly to talk about said game like it's your girlfriend, but at the same time, in an age of AI slop, it's more clear than ever how important the bonds we form with certain pieces of media are. It can suck when a game you love makes a change that makes you love it less, but reveling in that game's failure and then rooting for it to die is an unhealthy way of dealing with your emotions. Except when it comes to my relationship with this fucking monkey. He can kill it. Do you want my advice? If you're dissatisfied with a game you once enjoyed, just stop playing it. Doesn't have to be forever, you can treat it like a hiatus if you want. Go and see what alternatives there are out on the market. Have your fun with them, and then when you start to get a little bored by them, come back to the original game and see if anything's changed. Maybe they fixed that thing you hated while you were away. Maybe you just realized you only hated it so much because you were playing the game too often. Maybe you find that nothing has really changed, but hey, at least you went and explored some alternatives. That's what Marvel Rivals was always going to end up as for Overwatch, an alternative. I know I praised a lot of the things that Marvel Rivals does better than Overwatch earlier, but I very intentionally didn't say the game itself was better, because it never was, even in Overwatch's dark ages. And you know what? It also wasn't worse. It was always just different. On the surface, these games play fairly similar, yeah, but if you played them both for any amount of time, you'll realize they are ultimately very different games appealing to very different kinds of people. If Marvel Rivals was just Overwatch but better, I hate to tell you, dog, that would probably just be plagiarism. All this is to say, when a game you love finds itself in the shitter, look for greener pastures. And when you see discussion about that game you left behind, don't seek to tear it down, try and make it better. There is no insert game here, Keller. There's just you and a game. There really is nothing else to it. The end. Oh shit, wait, now I still gotta talk about how Overwatch got better.
Everybody, yeah. Rock your body, yeah. Everybody, yeah. Rock your body right. Back streets back, alright. We're back again.
It's January of 2025. Overwatch 2 has hit rock bottom. Widow is busy teabagging its corpse while the new king of the hero shooter is reveling in a sea of praise. To be fair, there is a lot of discussion about Overwatch at this moment, but none of it is good. Flash forward, it's February of 2026. Overwatch has just received an update so big that the two fell right off the name. Marvel Rivals is still extremely popular, but as was bound to happen once the new game smell wore off, it started to show some of its flaws. And generally speaking, if you asked a fan of both these games which is better, it would probably be a fairly tough decision. How exactly did we get from point A to point B? Well, my friend, I've been purposely omitting some information this entire time. Overwatch might have been shot in the head 3 times by an enemy Widow, but do you want to know why it survived those first 2 headshots? It had a Mercy on its team, dog, and she's got res. It would be easy to say that the reason Overwatch started to get better was because Marvel Rivals gave it the kick up the butt it needed and the developers actually started trying. And while I'm certain Marvel Rivals certainly made the Overwatch team shit their pants for a minute there, I think the truth is a little bit more complicated. I hate it when people act like developers are just a bunch of dickheads sitting around not acting on player feedback just because they think they know better. I'm certain there are cases where the developers do think they know better and their game is harmed as a result of that, but I think it's a really strange angle to take to treat that as if it's malicious. They developed the game, man. They probably do know better a lot of the time, and sometimes that can be a blessing and a curse. Sometimes they see things more clearly than their player base because of how intimately they know their game, and other times their close proximity to the art they're making means that they don't. But it's just weird to act like they're sitting in their offices trying to figure out how they can best piss off their player base when their player base is the only reason they have jobs to begin with. I think most often the parts of games we as players complain about are put there because of decisions made by corporate executives trying to boost profit. And I think when they're not, it's just because it usually takes developers some buffer time and some repercussions to realize that they actually need to listen to their player base. And if you're mad that they often take so long to admit that they're wrong, at least they do usually admit they're wrong. When was the last time you conceded a point, Derek? In the case of Overwatch 2, I think it had such a bad run of things, partly because the developers needed to listen to player feedback more quickly, yeah. Partly because they actually needed to face some competition, sure, but I think the real reason Overwatch 2 was going downhill for so long was because of a couple bad decisions that were made early on and snowballed. The decision to make a sequel was not a good one. Trying to work on a PvE game mode whilst also currently updating the PvP was never going to be feasible, and adjusting the game to a 5v5 format was always going to be a bigger job than just rebalancing some things. These issues meant that from 2019 to 2024, even when the developers were making positive changes to the game, they were always doing so on the back foot. The graphical update was great. The game has released a million new characters since it first came out, and while some have been unbalanced on launch, none have ever felt unfun to play, and they've also continued to add new maps, game modes, and events for as long as the game has existed. But all of those good changes to the game were made whilst a lot of development effort was still going towards fixing a couple decisions they made back in 2019. The good parts were rolled out slow and weren't met with a lot of excitement because all attention was fixed on Overwatch's issues. But in 2024, once they'd finally made the decision to drop PvE, a large part of the problem-fixing development team must have been reunited with the Make Good Stuff development team. And so for the first time in more than half this franchise's lifetime, the Overwatch team got to plant their feet in the ground and breathe. And though Although it would naturally take them a minute to catch their breath, once they did, things finally started to change. The first sign of this, I think, came in July of 2024, a bit after Marvel Rivals was announced, but a bit before it launched. Aaron Keller, the game director for Overwatch, released a blog post entitled Director's Take, opening up the conversation on 5v5 and 6v6. And this addressed a lot of the issues people were having with the new structure of the game. And I think it's important to note that Keller didn't just concede and say, alright, you guys asked for 6v6, so we're going back to it. He recapped how they got to the decision for 5v5, outlined very clearly the advantages and disadvantages of it with data that would have normally otherwise have been the developer's little secret, and said the team was going to do tests to see whether teams of 6 could return in some fashion. I think this is one of the best developer blogs I have ever read. It's also one of the only developer blogs I've ever read, but I really like it anyway because I think it was a masterclass in meeting the community where they were at. It was saying very clearly, we're going to do what you guys want, but also here's why we didn't do that in the first place. Following this, the team started rolling out some different 6v6 trials to see how it might work. Importantly, at one point they released a game mode that was exactly the same as when Overwatch 1 first launched, and I think that was a really good decision because it helped people realize, maybe where we are right now isn't that bad. Eventually, 6v6 would just become another quick play in competitive mode. You could choose to play role queue, or you could go with 2 teams of 6, no role restrictions. I think doing this must have taken a massive weight off the developers' shoulders because from this point onwards, it was a lot harder to complain about one of the main things people had been complaining about since Overwatch 2 released. 6v6 was back on the menu. This was not a change that I think was felt by the broader gaming community. This is just something that appeased the inner circle of Overwatch players who were frustrated with this part of the game. But doing that was the first step to getting Overwatch's reputation back on track, and the developers were just getting started. On February 13th of 2025, we saw the premiere of a live stream focusing on updates to the game that they called Overwatch 2 Spotlight. And this is where things would really start to get a move on. Sweeping changes to how the game would be played were announced. You would now get to pick perks mid-combat that would alter or buff certain parts of your character kit. A new core mode called Stadium, revolving around upgrading characters as matches progressed, was being added alongside a third-person mode. Of course, we also got your fairly standard reveals of a couple new heroes and maps and skins, but in an interesting twist, we also found out that a lot of features that had been removed when they deleted Overwatch 1 were coming back to the game with an updated look, including
Season 15 is the return of loot boxes.
This Spotlight event was the first showcase of what the developers could do now that they weren't shackled down by the PvE game mode. They could bring back loot boxes, not tie them to real world money, and make them a way of obtaining skins that were once only obtainable through premium currency. I mean, the sky was the fucking limit. Stadium in particular was set to be a massive addition to the game, adding new and reworked maps, crazy ability changes, and a third-person mode, all in service of creating a game mode that felt completely different to normal Overwatch. And of course, this was a couple months after Marvel Rivals release, so all the comments on the video are talking shit about how the developers are actually trying now that they have competition, because you know, they obviously threw all this shit together in like 3 weeks. But generally, I think I, and a lot of others as well, started to think, hold on, there's something different in the air, because all these changes were great. Stadium was fun, the new loot boxes made the monetization system a lot more tolerable, and the addition of perks, at least for me, kind of fixed the issues 5v5 had with counter swapping. There was a more defined disadvantage to continually swapping between characters now that staying on one would net you more powerful abilities. Not only was 6v6 now in the game for people who wanted that, but 5v5 was made enjoyable as well. The issue Overwatch had introduced with the number 2 had in the long term netted them 2 enjoyable core game modes instead of just 1. Throughout 2025, we saw the rollout of all these changes, and for the first time in a long time, the discussion throughout the fanbase started to become a lot more positive, or at least about as positive as it can be for an online shooter. The broader gaming community's opinion of Overwatch 2 certainly hadn't changed just yet, but the worst was well over, and apart from some jokes being made about them adding loot boxes back into the game, Overwatch, thankfully, managed to stay out of controversy for most of a year. That was crucial, because ultimately, time was going to be the only thing that could truly heal Overwatch's wounds, so just laying low for a year was sorely needed. People had to forget about the woes of Overwatch past for a bit, dog on some other games. That way, right when people weren't expecting it, they could sneak attack them with an announcement that would shock the nation. And so a year after that first Overwatch spotlight, they came back for another round of reveals. And this would be the moment where I think Overwatch truly started to win people back over. There are a lot of great announcements in this live stream, but you know the one that mattered. 5 new heroes launching all at the same time, and a commitment to 5 more before the year is out. Turns out these developers might have known what they were doing after all. This announcement was very smart. I think the Overwatch 2 team knew they needed to do something big to win back the favor of players of yesteryear, and to just generally rehabilitate their image. And other than maybe like releasing PvE, this was the only thing that was going to do that. Overwatch's Steam player count spiked to over 150,000 people when this update launched, more than double the game's previous previous high on that platform. A little over 12 months ago, if you had told someone that Overwatch would be able to bring that many people back to the game after its image sunk to such a catastrophic low, they would have called you crazy. Sitting here today, on a date that I'm afraid to admit in case I procrastinate this video for 9 months, Overwatch has re-established itself as a leader in the hero shooter genre. And though I'm sure sentiment will eventually turn on it once again when they give Mercy a third mythic or something, I think it's proven it can withstand a couple mistakes. And that's the weird thing, I'm kind of glad it made those mistakes. Overwatch has faced an incredibly rocky road to finally get to where it is now, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but I don't think I would have had it any other way.
It's been a long day without you, my friend, and I'll tell you all about it when I see you again. We've come a long way from where we began. Oh, I'll tell you all about it when I see you again.
Overwatch has had a rough decade, but even through all its controversial moments, I'll tell you one thing for damn certain. It has never not been interesting. There's a reason the changes the Overwatch team make to their game seem to penetrate the broader gaming discussion more often than something coming out of a game like Rainbow Six Siege does. It's because since the announcement of Overwatch 2, you have never been able to say the developers haven't been trying shit. The first 3 years of the Overwatch franchise were pretty by the book. There were new characters and maps being added, but that was about it. The game was certainly liked a lot more then, but I think if it had continued along that path, it probably would have lost more players and it ended up losing in this current timeline we're in. And I know that sounds crazy, but please just hear me out. All of Overwatch's problems have stemmed from it attempting new things, but had it not been doing that, I think it would have been facing a far larger problem, that being that it would have been boring. That's something that actually kills games. Doing the same thing year in, year out usually means that players start to die off pretty quickly. Look at any game that's lasted longer than 10 years, and I can guarantee you the updates it's getting now are probably fairly different to the updates it was getting when it first released. And this is where I'd like to talk about someone I mentioned earlier, Aaron Keller, the game director of Overwatch. Keller has been in this position for almost 5 years now, and though I don't think he's hated by the community, I think most people would agree he hasn't been accepted by them the same way the previous game director, Jeff Kaplan, was. This goofy guy, Jeff Kaplan, led development of Overwatch 1 from its conception way back in 2013 all the way through to 2021. And though people certainly love to clown on the guy from time to time, he managed to maintain a level of reverence amongst the player base that I think is rare to see amongst people in that sort of position. Lead developers are generally the most public-facing role in video game development, and so a video game community's opinion on the lead developer for their game generally tends to match whatever the opinion on that game currently is. If you're the lead developer for a fresh and exciting new video game that receives consistent updates of a reasonable quality, chances are your community will probably either A, sing your praises and immortalize you within it as some sort of living meme, or B, they'll just ignore you and leave you to do your work. If you're the lead developer for Overwatch 2 on the other hand, maybe install some more locks on your doors, bud. Jeff Kaplan, generally speaking, was a pretty beloved figurehead of the Overwatch franchise. His leaving was always going to sting a little, especially because he'd made a pretty active effort to interact with the community. He used to do these little developer updates that became quite iconic to anyone who played at the time, and when he very abruptly left the development team with only a short blog post saying goodbye, it did sting a bit. Stepping into Jeff's shoes, Aaron Keller was always going to have a lot to live up to, and I'm sure many would say he did not do that. But here's the thing, Aaron Keller became lead developer for Overwatch 2 at a very difficult time. I absolutely don't think Jeff Kaplan was wrong for leaving the development team, and I mean no disrespect to the guy, but he did leave right before shit was about to hit the fan. My man saw the ship sailing for the Titanic and ran for the life rafts before the passengers even knew they were in trouble. Which again is fine, I'm pretty sure the dude just wanted to retire. Or he wanted to leave because the Overwatch League was putting too much pressure on the development team or something? I don't know, man. Why are you going on a podcast for 5 hours right before I was going to upload this shit? What the fuck, Jeffrey? All I'm saying is that Aaron Keller came into this role right around the time that I'm sure the development team was starting to realize some decisions they'd made a long time ago were starting to snowball. They were about to have to face the hard reality that Overwatch 2 was way further away from launching than it needed to be, and that they did not have the resources to continue putting out new content for the first game in the meantime. And on top of that, this is also probably where I'm sure they started to realize that their PvE game mode was just not working in the way they needed it to, and that it was going to need some large-scale changes as well. Aaron Keller inherited an absolute shitstorm of problems when he stepped into this role. The same shitstorm of problems I said put the development team on the back foot for so long, and the man just sort of had to sit there and help his team endure it. But see, there's this weird thing about Keller's time as lead developer on the game. Though most others, had they been stepping into this role, probably would have chosen to play it pretty safe around this time, Aaron Keller didn't. and I think that's something people ought to acknowledge when they speak about him. Because Keller, it seems, for better or worse, isn't one for playing it safe. This is a man who understands that a game needs to evolve for it to survive, and so during his time as lead developer, Overwatch has changed far more than it ever did before he was in that position. It was only around a month after stepping into this new role that the team announced Overwatch 2 was going to be 5v5 instead of 6v6, and I don't know how much of this change was actually the result of Keller being game director, but I have to assume that he was at the very least the person who signed off on it becoming official. And you gotta admit, whether you like it or not, that must have taken some balls. I'll remind you, this is a man who I think was very nervous stepping into this role, by the way. You can see it in any of the videos he appeared in the year following him becoming game director. The man seemed a bit stilted to say the least, and certainly didn't seem ready to become the new figurehead for such a beloved gaming franchise. And who knows, maybe old A-Dog is the most confident person you've ever met when you step behind closed doors, but regardless, if you were only to rewatch old clips of him, you would assume he would not be the kind of person to make a decision as bold as switching the beloved 6v6 hero shooter to a different format so early on in his tenure. And yet again, for better or worse, that happened under him, and I think that's because the man cares about change. He knows that for Overwatch to survive, things can't stay the same forever. Overwatch 1 didn't release a new core game mode for the entirety of its life cycle, but under Keller they released 2, 3 if you want to count the one that was announced before he took over as game director. And again, those game modes aren't liked nearly as much as the ones Overwatch first released with, but I do think the game would be infinitely worse for it not least having attempted them. Once the team had cut their losses on PvE and were able to finally switch their focus entirely to the PvP side of the game, that's when we really started to see some crazy decisions getting made. If you had told someone back in 2016 that Overwatch would one day have a perk system, they probably would have told you that that sounds stupid and such a thing would have been completely antithetical to what made the game good in the first place. But in 2026, I think we can look back on this decision and say, yeah, it was probably the right one to make. And then there's Stadium. It's such a weird idea for a game mode, and the amount of development time it must have taken to make probably wouldn't have seemed worth it for most people. But it got made anyway, and I'm very glad it exists. It's a fun little side adventure I get to go on now when I start becoming a little bored of the main game. And launching 5 new heroes at once? Yeah, that was always going to be a bit of a win, but no PTR, no nothing. They just put them into the game and waited to see what would happen. And they weren't super basic designs that didn't stand a chance of upsetting balance either. The cat could fly enemy tanks off the map. And you know what? You gotta admit, that's kinda hardcore. I don't think Aaron Keller is the only reason these things I just mentioned are in the game. But I do think, had someone else taken over from Jeff Kaplan, I can see a world in which Overwatch 2 was delayed another 2 years, released with a middling PvE game mode, and then having lost the attention of the broader gaming community, slowly faded into obscurity. I'm personally very happy Keller is in the role he's in, because I'm certain we'll be getting a lot of new content that the community really wants, but I'm also pretty damn sure that we'll be getting a lot of other new content that the community doesn't even know it wants yet. Aaron, thanks for steering the ship the past couple of years, and for what it's worth, I do really think you've found your voice as a public-facing member of the development team. Do more interviews, dude. You're really good off the cuff. And to the rest of the Overwatch development team, thank you for having made and continuing to make a game that I think I'll enjoy for as long as it's alive.
Hi there.
I'm going to turn a light off for this section. We'll see if that makes it moody. I don't know. Does it just make my face look bad? On the 24th of March, 2016, which I promise you is the last date I'll be saying in this video, the Play Overwatch YouTube channel uploaded a cinematic called Recall. In it, Winston, that son of a bitch, is contemplating whether he should try and reassemble Overwatch when an evil man with shotguns comes along to give me false hope. Winston survives this encounter, of course, because he remembers something the man who raised him once told him during a pivotal moment in his life.
Never accept the world as it appears to be. Dare to see it for what it could be.
And I guess if in the last however many minutes of this video I have been trying to make a point, it's that. In the age of the internet, it is incredibly easy to get caught up in a sort of cynicism that only serves to make things you enjoy worse. This silly little thing called the World Wide Web has unfortunately been specifically designed to promote negativity, and that obviously sucks because we could all probably use a little bit more joy in our lives at the moment, but it's also bad because I think it degrades the power that actual well thought out criticism can have. When the most lucrative video you can make on literally any piece of art is insert name here is garbage, or insert name here is not as good as you think, or this thing is the insert game here killer, there is no incentive to try and help rebuild something when it's broken. Obviously, there are a lot of people providing criticism in good faith when Overwatch 2 was in the shitter, and a lot of videos that were named things like Overwatch is dead actually contained a lot of thoughtful feedback in them. But for every one of those videos, there was another that was actively rooting for the game to die. I guess I'm just kind of saying what Nakey Jakey said in his most recent video, but it's important and more people need to hear it. Look, point is, it's okay to think that something you once liked is bad. In fact, I'd say it's a lot worse to try and deny that when you know it's true. But it's also okay to admit that you would like things to go back to the way say they were, that you would like that thing you love to be better again. You don't have to revel in its failure. Sitting here today, I'm happy to say that the future of Overwatch looks bright, and unless they really fuck things up again, I don't think it will ever be as bad as it was just a couple years ago. But I also know that one day down the line, people will start to hate Overwatch again. I can't say why exactly, but I know that eventually the developers will stuff up again, and this moment of surprising positivity will disappear. And what I hope is that when that time comes, the people who need to step away from the game do, the people who choose to keep playing try and be constructive with their criticism, and I hope that we all remember that the low will eventually pass. Maybe those aren't realistic hopes, but damn it, you can't stop me from dreaming. There is no Overwatch killer, there's just us. We decide what happens to the art we love. My name's Itopher, thanks for watching, and DJ, play that Living Tombstone banger.
I'm not gonna need any kind of support.